Hello. In this video, we're going to be introducing GitHub Actions Importer and how you can use the product to migrate your workflows to GitHub Actions. Before we talk about what GitHub Actions Importer is as a product, it's helpful to outline the various phases that come with a migration to GitHub Actions. The first phase of any migration is planning. Some activities in this phase involve looking at your current CI/CD footprint to understand how many pipelines you have defined, any complexities that you should be aware of upfront, for example, if you have customizations built on top of a CI/CD provider, and trying to build a timeline of what pipelines are ready to migrate immediately, what pipelines need a little bit of work prior to being migrated, or what pipelines should not be migrated at all. For example, if you have a legacy or a defunct pipeline. The next phase of a migration is forecasting. This activity involves looking at your previous usage of your CI/CD systems and forecasting the amount of usage you'd have in GitHub Actions. This is incredibly helpful to understand the number of runners that you're consuming and the types of runners you're consuming in your CI/CD system, so that when you migrate to GitHub Actions, you have the number and type of runners available in order to meet your demands. And the final phase here of automation is more traditionally what you'd think of when you migrate to GitHub Actions, where you are converting a single pipeline to its equivalent workflow and validating that the behavior and functionality is the same. Once you've validated this behavior, this new workflow can be added to a GitHub repository and the migration is complete. Doing all three phases manually is not only very tedious, but it is incredibly error-prone. That is why GitHub Actions Importer was created. GitHub Actions Importer is a tool to both plan and automate your migration to GitHub Actions. There are 5 CI/CD systems supported by the product, and the goal of any migration, any converted workflow from GitHub Actions Importer, has a goal of converting at least 80% of any given workflow. The remaining percent must be converted manually, and as such, any output of the product should be reviewed with human eyes prior to taking it as your production workload. So let's see it in action. I'm going to be showing how GitHub Actions Importer can be used to migrate your CircleCI pipelines to GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions Importer is distributed as a Docker image and an extension to the GitHub CLI to interact with that Docker image. The first command that you'll run when you're setting up your environment to perform these migrations is the configure command. What the configure command will do is start an interactive command prompt to collect all the credentials needed in order to authenticate with your existing CircleCI projects and your desired GitHub repository. These credentials are persisted into a .env.local file, so you can run this command a single time and have the values persist across all of your migration commands. The next CLI command that you'll run fairly often is the update command. What this will do is update the Docker image that Actions Importer is running within to be the latest version. We ship new versions of this Docker image on a daily basis, so it is a best practice to run this command often in order to have the latest features and functionality present. The next CLI command that we will look at is the audit command. What an audit command will do is fetch all of the projects defined in a CircleCI organization, convert each of these pipelines to their equivalent GitHub Actions workflow, and then write a report that summarizes how complete and how complex of a migration is possible. Let's go ahead and run this command. Here we can see the last file that is written to disk is the audit summary. Let's take a look at these file contents. Here we can see a pretty simple markdown file format. However, the data contained within it is incredibly useful in order for planning your migration to actions. So here we can see in the CircleCI instance, there were 5 total pipelines. all of these were considered successful, meaning all of the constructs of the pipeline, all of the jobs, the stages, the triggers, etc., were converted to their equivalent GitHub Actions syntax, and all of the individual items, the individual build steps, the individual triggers were converted to an equivalent in GitHub Actions. Nothing was partially successful, but something would be considered this if an individual build step or an individual trigger was not automatically converted. 0 were using an unsupported pipeline type, and there were 0 failures. Next, we can see a breakdown of all the build steps used across these 5 pipelines. In this category of known items, this is the category of build steps that were automatically converted to their equivalent GitHub Actions action. Next, there is a category of unsupported build steps, meaning the functionality present here is functionally not compatible with GitHub Actions. In this case of setup remote Docker, this is a unique case where the Docker daemon is already present and running on GitHub Actions runners, so there's not actually any conversion work needed here. Next here is a list of all the actions that were used in order to convert these build steps. This list of actions is incredibly useful for planning any security reviews or compliance checks so that you know exactly which third-party and first-party dependencies you'll be taking once you migrate to GitHub Actions. Next, there is a similar breakdown here for the build triggers, environment variables, and a section of manual tasks that will be left to you, the person performing the migration, to complete. Manual task is something that is unable to be converted automatically, but it's something that we know and is referenced by converted pipelines. In the case of secrets, this is a secret value that is referenced by a couple of pipelines. However, the underlying value itself, in this case the SSH key and the known host, will need to be migrated and populated manually in GitHub Actions. The final category here in this audit summary is a list of all the files that are written to disk during the audit. Generally, there'll be 3 or more files written for each pipeline. One for the original pipeline definition itself in CircleCI, one for the raw network response or JSON data from the CircleCI APIs, and then 1 or more files for each GitHub Actions workflow that was converted. The next CLI command that we will look at is the forecast command. What the forecast command will do is fetch all the jobs that were completed after the specified start date. In this case, we're defaulting to the jobs that were completed in the past 7 days, and use that data to calculate metrics that show what your consumption of your current build infrastructure looks like today. Let's go ahead and run this command. As before, we can see a list of output files that were written to disk during this CLI command, and let's take a look at this forecast report. Here we can see over the past 7 days, there were a total of 9 jobs run across 9 unique pipelines. And there are metrics surrounding the total execution time. So in total, 54 minutes were consumed, and then min, median, max, and P90 metrics for how long each individual job takes to execute. Next, there are queue time metrics, so the time between when a job was requested to when an agent was available to run it, and then job concurrency metrics. What this metric is really useful for is informing you how many runners to set up in GitHub Actions in order to meet the same level of demand post-migration. These statistics are also calculated for each queue of runners that are currently being used in CircleCI. In this case, the majority of these pipelines were run on Docker containers, and there is a category here of these same statistics for all the Docker-related builds. This forecast report, again, is very helpful with planning your build agent needs so that once you migrate to GitHub Actions, you have enough runners present and available in order to meet your demands. The next CLI command that we will look at is the dry run command. Before we look at this command, I want to start by inspecting a CircleCI pipeline file. Here we can see in this config, we are defining a few different workflows. One workflow named build with a build job, one workflow named hello workflow that runs using an orb job, and then a job using a matrix. The dry run command will fetch this individual pipeline definition, convert it to its equivalent GitHub Actions workflow or workflows, and then write those files to your local file system. Let's go ahead and run this command. So here we can see there were a few files written to disk during this dry run. Let's take a look at the first one. This build workflow corresponds to the build job here. So it's using the same triggers and is performing the same steps defined in this CircleCI file. The next is this hello workflow. This itself is referencing a composite action, which in CircleCI was making use of an orb command. And this composite action is used so that the same level of reusability and composability is present in the converted workflow. And the final file written to disk here is the matrix test. This is again the same functionality defined in CircleCI, but using GitHub Actions syntax. The last CLI command that we will look at is the migrate command. What the migrate command will do is again fetch an individual pipeline definition, convert it to its equivalent GitHub Actions workflow or workflows, and then open up a pull request directly to your desired GitHub repository. So let's go ahead and run this command. Here we can see a link to a pull request URL written to the console. The first thing that you will notice is that a pull request description was authored on your behalf. Here we can see there were a handful of referenced secrets, so values that were encrypted in CircleCI that were not able to be converted manually or converted automatically, that will need to be manually migrated. However, the files that were added to this pull request are the exact same file contents that were used during the dry run command. This pull request is a great and natural place to have any final code review or CI checks for these new files prior to merging this pull request and completing the migration of this CircleCI pipeline to GitHub Actions. And that's end-to-end how you can use GitHub Actions Importer to plan, forecast, and automate your migration of CircleCI pipelines to GitHub Actions.